of Education. Chairman Fielding Ralston, our chairman of the State Board of Education, is on with us today. Dr. Hayburn is traveling and will listen in via cell. I know we have Chairman Harry Brooks is with us, and a few others that have logged in. But Mr. Chairman Fielding, are you ready, sir?
I'm ready. We certainly want to welcome everybody who made time this afternoon for this meeting. As you recognize, this is an extremely important committee, and given the great results we had last year in terms of what was approved by the legislature and the governor, we certainly recognize how important this committee is. First thing we'd like to do is get Phyllis to call the roll. So Phyllis, if you could call the roll.
And if we know someone who's joined us electronically, we'll make note of that as well.
Lyle Alshire. Representative Brooks.
He's here.
David Connor.
David Connor joined us previously.
David Connor.
I'm here.
Okay. Senator Gresham. Ben Torres.
I'm here, Ben Torres.
Senator Gresham.
I think so.
Senator Gresham, are you here? Vincent Harvell.
Have not entered any numbers. Please re-enter your meeting ID followed by the pound or hash sign.
Chris Henson.
I'm here.
Sarah Hayburn.
She's by phone.
Dorsey Hobson.
Have not entered any numbers. Please
Karen King.
pound or hash sign.
Stephen Smith for Candace McQueen.
I'm here.
Larry Martin. Wayne Miller.
Goodbye.
Mitchell Moore. Bruce Davis.
I'm here.
Don Odom. Lanice Patrick.
Cliff Lippert here representing Lenise.
Okay. Larry Ridings. Fielding Ralston.
Here.
Mary Ann Sparks.
Yeah, that's good.
Justin Wilson.
Linda Weston here for the comptroller.
Hunter Zanardi. Mike Dedman or Greg Turner. Melissa Brown.
We see her on. We're going to count her as present because we know she's on. Mr. Chairman, we show a total of 16 on, and so you certainly have a quorum, and being that we don't have anything on the agenda that's going to call for a substantive vote, I think we're good to proceed, sir.
Okay, good. Well, we certainly want to thank the members for their work. I think it's important to note that everything that the committee reported last year, asked for last year, was approved by the General Assembly and the governor, making it by far the most successful report that we've had. And we certainly want to thank this committee for their work. In fact, it was the largest increase that we've had in K-12 expenditures in any year that did not involve a tax increase. So certainly great results from last year. We certainly want to thank the Governor, the General Assembly for their work and for approving these recommendations. I think it does illustrate that what we did last year was to focus on some real high priority recommendations and made it kind of less of a shopping list last year, and this seemed to work for us. So certainly want to thank all the committee members for their work on that. The first thing we want to do is to recognize Nathan and give us a report on the member survey and an overview of the committee, and then we will move to Stephen Smith for a complete discussion of the BEP Enhancement Act that was passed this last year. So Nathan, if you could go forward.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Happy to. And I want to thank everybody for participating in our SurveyMonkey process there that allowed us to take a look at everyone's priorities for the next year. There were certainly a few themes that came out across the surveys, but absolutely number one among them was a thorough review of the new law, and that's something that we'll get into shortly. There was folks had interest in sustained technology funding, funding the number of guidance counselors and education support services at a level closer to national best practices. I know Chairman Brooks, who's on the line, but his line is muted at the moment. He was having some technical issues. He and I participated in a couple of different events where that issue came up, and I know that's of importance to him. There was some interest in studying the feasibility of extending the school year, and another one was we wanted one of our priorities to be to keep the pressure on, keep the discussion going about the continued commitment to teacher compensation all the way around. And another area that came up was the funding of RTI positions. Because folks have had trouble getting in today and you know, with the format, but also because of so many scheduling conflicts, I didn't think it was necessarily appropriate that we picked our priorities necessarily today, but instead use this time together as a way to set the new ground level. In other words, how are things going to be in the BEP world from this point forward? And if that makes sense, and there's no questions about it, or if there are questions about okay. In that case, Mr. Chairman, I think probably the prudent thing to do is to go ahead and recognize our Deputy Commissioner of Education, Stephen Smith, on the BEP Enhancement Act that's passed. So, ladies and gentlemen, what I'm going to suggest is that we stay muted until the end of the presentation, but please make note of the questions that you want to ask. Electronically to switch back and forth and mute and unmute everybody is somewhat difficult, so we may just mute the lines, have the presentation, and then come back with a robust discussion and whatever questions that are appropriate, you know, or that you all think are important. Is that all right with you, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, that sounds fine. Let's go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman, members, Nathan. I have Mary Ann Dursey with me here today, and we are both here happy to talk about this subject and certainly want to leave time for a lot of questions. But we really are thrilled to be able to talk to you all about the historic funding improvements that were enacted with Public Chapter 1020 in the BEP Enhancement Act. And it really does represent a historic improvement in education funding in this state. It also signifies a tremendous partnership between the administration, the General Assembly, and all of our stakeholders. And I think that there's evidence of that from the fact that this bill passed unanimously. So to think that you would have a major piece of legislation dealing with the BEP that would go through the entire process without one negative vote, that is truly remarkable. And I think it shows that we had a really tremendous effort from across the board from everyone that was involved in this topic. It's always important, I think, when talking about the BEP to give a little bit of background and context. Most of you are familiar with these points, but I always think it's important to go through them again. The BEP, of course, was enacted in 1992. It was in response to a successful legal challenge by many of our state's small schools. And the contention at the time was that the students in those districts did not have an equal opportunity to receive an education because the local communities did not have the same ability to fund education. And the court agreed with the plaintiff. In 2007, the General Assembly adopted revisions to the BEP. That was known as BEP 2.0, and BEP 2.0 established new funding goals for the state, and it also set the state on a new path of determining how we distribute funds. There's been a lot of debate and discussion since the adoption of BEP 2.0, and that debate is around funding, but also just around funding in general, but also specifically distribution. Over the last 2 years, through the BEP task force that was established by the governor, also this committee, and certainly other means, the administration studied the BEP extensively, and that, of course, with the BEP Review Committee recommendations, and I wanted to review those that Chairman Ralston discussed. If you look back at the BEP Review Committee recommendations from November of 2015, there were 4 recommendations. The 12th month of insurance, teacher compensation, the removal of the early graduation funding penalty, and then increased funding for technology. And so we'll revisit those as we go through the presentation, but I just wanted to remind everybody about those 4 priorities. And while through all this study, it's been very clear that all school districts supported more funding, but it's also clear that there really was no consensus on how the funding should be divided. I also want to discuss a little bit about where we were coming into this year. I think sometimes there seems to be so much focus on what has not been done or additional needs that are being recommended, but the reality is we've made tremendous progress in Tennessee in terms of K through 12 funding. If you look from 2011 to 2016, so even prior to this year's improvements, Governor and the General Assembly partnered to improve the BEP by $5 billion, and that included $240 million for teacher salaries. Since that same time, the state ranks in the top 10 of all states in terms of our percentage increase in state spending for K through 12. And so coming into this year, we really had a tremendous opportunity to continue the momentum, and I'm very pleased that together we were able to seize this opportunity. So looking at specifics, in the BEP Enhancement Act, coupled with the budget that was adopted by the General Assembly, it resulted in a total BEP improvement of $223 million. And as the chairman noted, this is the largest increase in education funding in history, the largest increase without a corresponding tax increase. And even if you include tax increases, it's the second largest in history. So extremely significant. Also, there's been a lot of discussion about 2.0, and I think sometimes it gets lost. People have confusion about what full implementation of BEP 2.0 would really mean in terms of funding. And we'll talk more about this, but I just wanted to point out that the funding amount, the improvement, the $223 million, actually exceeded the amount that was necessary to fully implement BEP 2.0, or the former law. Looking specifically, when you break down the components and the funding improvements, almost $105 million for teacher salaries. Again, that's the most ever without a tax increase. About $30 million for the 12th month of insurance. $15 million for technology. That doubles the state's investment for technology. Nearly $20 million for high-need student populations. That includes ELL funding. That was about $14 million, and then special education funding was about $5 million. When it was all said and done, we have about $40 million for enrollment growth and inflation. And then also we had $9 million added to the budget to account for high growth school systems. So this is $9 million that would be distributed based on current year enrollment growth.
Stephen, let me ask, one of the questions that came up in the survey was some great interest in this 12-month insurance. They wanted to know the actual money spent now versus the money spent on insurance 4 years ago. Not that that's necessarily something we'd have with us, but I'd be happy to email the raw figures out to the membership if they're interested. So.
Yeah, we'd be glad to find that. I don't have that today, but
Sure.
We'll be happy to do that. It's been when you consider last year, the additional, adding the 11th month and then the 12th month for this year, it's pretty substantial. Looking at equity, because when you're talking about the BEP, you really have to pay attention to equity. That's the BEP was built upon this issue of equity. And when you're talking about equity, that really relates to how the funds are distributed among the state. So the prior law, BEP 2.0, provided for full implementation of what's known as the SEBR model, or the Fox model after Bill Fox. Prior to that, we had the TASER funding model, the fiscal capacity model. So as I was discussing before, there's been a lot of debate about the distribution of the dollars. And so in part because of that debate, but also just because of available revenue, for the past 9 years, the BEP has been distributing dollars based on both models. So equally weighting the TASER model and the SEBR model. So there has been a lot of discussion about that, and I would say that was the primary topic of the BEP task force that was created by the governor. And after extensive study and review, ultimately the administration and the General Assembly determined that the current use of both models actually results in a fair and equitable and reasonable distribution of funds. We've also had some confirmation of this through national studies. There's a group called Education Trust that put out a report last year, and it ranked Tennessee 5th in the country in terms of equity within our formula. Getting back to some more specifics that are in Public Chapter 1020, again, it does implement the record funding improvements that were in the budget. It does codify the current method of distribution, the method that we've used for the past 9 years, so using the TASER model and the SEBR model and equally weighting those models. And it does continue the existing state and local funding splits. So that's 70% state funding for instructional, 75% for classroom, and 50% for non-classroom. I will point out that the new law does separate the instructional into two categories, instructional salaries and instructional benefits, and the state will pick up 70% on both of those. I want to get back to 2.0 because there's been discussion at times about, well, this is great, but if the state had implemented 2.0 fully, then it would have been a lot more dollars for school systems. And the fact of the matter is that that's not an accurate statement. So if you go back to 2011 and you include the improvements that have been made for FY17, we will have exceeded the funding goals of BEP 2.0 by $178 million statewide. I think there's a typo in that first bullet. And that's the case for every single school district. So every single school district in the state will have received more dollars under the improvements made by Governor Haslam and the General Assembly than that would be required under 2.0. And again, using 2011 as a base year. A couple of other provisions in the law that are important. One, we did have a change in the definition for at-risk, and you all may recall we had a discussion about this in the review committee last year about this very topic, the at-risk definition, and because of the changes that have taken place at the federal level around the community eligibility option and the funding of school lunch, we needed to make a change, and so we are now going to be using direct certification numbers for funding purposes in the at-risk category. And what that means is that the dollar amount that's associated per student goes up. The overall number of students goes down. We have fewer students on direct cert than we do that were identified under the old free and reduced price lunch. And so to make this revenue neutral to the state, we've increased the dollar amount that's associated with those students. We did condense the special education options from 10 options to 4. We also needed to do that because of being out of compliance with federal requirements, and we needed to remove the funding disincentive that districts had to place students in less restrictive environments. So we've made a lot of progress here, and that resulted in a $5 million improvement in special education funding. We did make adjustments to the cost differential factor. The BEP 2.0 eliminated CDF. It called for the elimination of CDF. We had been funding it at 50%. The new law funds CDF at 25% for this next fiscal year, and then it is set to phase out as new funds are invested in salaries, although there's not a specific time frame for that phase out. Just a little more info on CDF. CDF is an add-on to the formula that provides additional funds to districts with non-governmental wages above the state average. And as you all know, there has been a lot of debate about CDF since the inception of the BEP. And you can see the numbers that have gone into CDF over the course of the last few years. The overwhelming majority of those dollars have gone to 3 school districts. And in effect, in order to pay for CDF, you have to have funds to do it, and ultimately those funds are coming from dollars that would be in the salary component, that dollars that benefit teacher salaries for all school systems. There is some protection for CDF systems in the law. So one, we had a record investment, so that certainly helps offset CDF losses. We do maintain 25% CDF funding in FY17. We do have minimum funding levels, so we have hold harmless clauses that hold districts to FY17 levels, and that of course would include any CDF dollars that have been earned to date. And then we have mandatory increases. So we have mandatory increases for salaries, insurance, ELL, and then the special education improvements. A couple of other provisions of note. Over the past few years, we've heard concerns from legislators and others, and they've said, you know, we've really put a lot of money into teacher salaries, and we want to make sure that we want to have some assurances that those dollars are actually being allocated for teacher salaries. And so we did make some adjustments in the law, and the new law says that the funds that are earned through the salary component must be spent on salaries and wages unless the LEA's average teacher salary exceeds the statewide average. And in that case, the funds must be spent on benefits, or could also be spent on benefits. So the change here really is, even before, all the money earned for teacher salaries had to be spent on compensation, either salaries or benefits. Now we're saying that if you are below that average teacher salary, and the salary figure that we're using is the weighted average teacher salary, which this committee is very familiar with. That's what this committee uses when it analyzes salary disparity. So if a system is below that average, then it has to use that money for salaries and cannot use that money for benefits as well as salaries. We also removed rounding from the formula. We talked about this in the committee as well, and what that does is it ensures that when a student enters or leaves a district, that there will be a financial impact. We did remove the early graduation financial penalty. So when you look at the other improvements that we've already noted, plus this one, that captures every recommendation that the BEP Review Committee made in late 2015.
Stephen, can you talk for a minute just about the process of that was undertaken in the legislation to remove the early graduation financial penalty? I know there was some question about that it wasn't maybe as clear to some of the folks as some of the other ones were, and I knew you were involved in that process.
Are you referring to the effective date, really, or when
Yeah,
it actually
yeah.
takes place?
It seemed like some of the pieces were immediate and others were phased in over the course of the next.
Well, for this one, remember, this law didn't go into effect until July 1. And so what that means is that we're really talking about this next school year. It's not the previous school year that was just completed.
Right.
So early graduates that a district had in this just completed school year, that financial penalty is still going to exist, but it's going forward because we base our funding on prior year enrollment.
Sure.
So it's going forward that the early graduates would remain on the school district books for funding purposes. And then lastly, the law requires the commissioner to develop a standardized system of school level funding reporting. And this was something that came out of the BEP task force, where I think people felt like we've done a pretty good job as a state in providing transparency in how we fund individual districts, but perhaps data or information available to the public about how districts fund individual schools is lacking and could be improved. And so that's something that we will be looking at going forward. Just a couple of closing thoughts. Again, I think that the governor and the General Assembly have made really tremendous investments in public education. If you go back to those numbers that I talked about from 2011 and 2016, and then add this record investment, now we're talking about $723 billion infused in K through 12 since 2011, and $345 billion for teacher salaries. I mean, I think that's tremendous. And this plan, again, specifically addresses each of the priorities identified by the review committee. And we believe that this plan will continue to move our entire state forward and bring some clarity to the funding formula. With that, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, we're going through the process of unmuting. And so we're ready for any questions. Everybody unmuted?
Mm-hmm. Nathan, will you be sharing those slides with all of us?
Absolutely, yeah, and it's on electronically through the program, but I'll tell you what, as soon as we're done here, I will go and email them out to everybody. Is everyone good? Is that a thorough enough explanation of the new law? Okay. Well, we're going to assume it was extraordinary. And
Either that or people can't figure out how to
unmute it.
Well, this is Fielding. I think it was a good explanation, and Stephen, we certainly thank you for that review. It was well done and very complete. We also want to thank you for all your service to K-12 education over the last several years. We certainly enjoyed working with you. I think you had great success, and we certainly want to wish you the very best as you move back into the private sector.
Well, thank you, Chairman. I really appreciate that.
Are there any questions? Or we got some time here. We committed to complete this by 3 o'clock, or 2 o'clock Central Time. Any additional questions, comments, things we need to be working on?
I think our next steps, Mr. Chairman, are that we'll probably be getting in touch with everyone about the next availability. We had talked last year about producing something preliminary, or to maybe delineating our list of agreed on priorities so that we could get those to the department and to F&A, to the administration as they're building next year's budget cycle. Obviously, we picked fairly well, and I think we made a compelling case this last year in terms of those priorities, and they were right along with some others. So I think the thing to do for members is to watch your email over the course of the next month, and at the next meeting, I think we'll be able to lock in our agreed upon priorities, and then turn that into a working document that we can share with the administration to let them know what's important moving into the not only budget approval process but the creation process. I know last year, the report was done sort of at the tail end of what's authorized by law, but having looked in the previous years, it was done at that time many years as well. So we'll try to make the process more helpful to the appropriators and more helpful to those who are in the budget building process. With that, Mr. Chairman, I think you're free to adjourn the meeting unless anyone has other remarks.
Okay, any other comments or questions? Okay, again, we appreciate everybody's participation. With that, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you.